If you ever heard your parents or relatives say, back in my days, I bought my flat for just $50,000, you've probably wondered why HDB prices seem so much higher today. And the question is, are HDB flats still affordable today, or have buying a home become really out of reach for the next generation? Joining me in this discussion is Dinesh, who himself is a very passionate person when it comes to property. Dinesh, welcome to the show.
Definitely happy to be on the show discussing property. I think I own a HDB myself and happy to talk about the prices.
Right, so our topic today is why buying a HDB flat is no longer as cheap as it used to be and why it's okay. Right, so my first question to you, Dinesh, is this, right? So how much on average HDB prices increased since the 80s?
To answer that question, just got to reference this speech by PM Lawrence Wong when he gave this speech in 2023 May Day rally. 4-room BTO flat in a new town used to cost about $40,000 in the 1980s. Right, back then the median income was then $900. Translation, meant like a typical household would spend a quarter of their income servicing their housing loan. Right, so then we fast forward to that 2023 speech in that scenario. The 4-room flat in a non-mature estate like Bukit Batok priced at $350,000. So cost-wise, it went up slightly less than 10 times. About 9 times more. But the median household income has also risen about 10 times, right? From $900 to about $9,000. The argument is that BTO prices have largely kept pace with household income. On one hand, it's quite simple to understand why, right? Inflation. I think we all know what inflation means, especially after COVID-19. We kind of understood it as a nation or as a globe, what inflation means. So prices go up each and every year. And even if we take like very long time scales, so this was 1980 to 2023, 43 years, or your household income also experienced inflation, right? Yep. So your income also inflated.
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is that the GDP, Singapore today is very different from what it was in the 80s. And obviously our earnings have thankfully risen tremendously as we become a developed nation and we have very high value jobs that helps to increase salary. And I think a natural outcome of any developed city or developed country is that naturally your property price will also increase as your people are earning more. So I think it's a question I ask myself, which is that, is it even realistic for Singaporeans to expect flat prices, whether it's BTO or resale flat, to actually be lower when our earnings are going up?
I think it's one thing complaining about it. And it's very real. I'm not trying to downplay like people's frustrations or people's aspirations today, right? But I'm just trying to think back to the 1980s, people buying that flat at $40,000. I think they may have had similar concerns as we are having today. So being able to afford their property is not always a straightforward decision. No matter which time frame you're in, 1980s or 2023, 2025 today, you're going to have that worry, whether you can afford it, whether it's cost of living. All these things are human worries. It's not going to go away. In 2053, when some of our kids are going to buy their properties, it will also be there, I think.
Yep. I was just looking at household income over the years because I was very curious how it has been, right? And so I found this stats. I think this was from National Archive of Singapore, NAS. And I was just looking at the stats when they talk about median household income, right? In 1990, the median household income in Singapore is $2,296. So, in 10 years, it's kind of risen by about double. So I guess that's good because, people earn more in 1990 than they earn in 1980. More interestingly, right, I just remember when my parents bought their second flat. It was in Tampines when they bought it. So they first had an Ang Mo Kio flat before even 1980, I think. In 1990, I think they bought their second flat. And my dad paid about $100,000. This was from the government. 5 to 10 years later, they sold it and it was about $150,000. Right. So this was somewhere in the 1990 period. Mm-hmm. And recently I went to check how much that flat would have cost, right? It was about $700,000 right now. So actually about 4 to 5 times more expensive today than when my dad sold it in the open market back then. Whereas when it looked at median household income, it's gone up by about 4 to 5 times also.
Yeah.
In that way, I was just thinking to myself, it's actually relatively on par. Obviously, some people will criticize and say that the lease now is a lot shorter. That is true, but also do remember back then, Tampines, the town that we were living in, was way less developed also. It just makes me feel like, hey, actually quite accurate, right?
I think home prices are always going to reflect our salaries. The one thing that I think always makes sense to me is that, okay, maybe in the 1980s, household income was made up of one person working.
More of them is one person.
Today, I think most households are two person working, right?
Yep.
And therefore, the household income is made up of two persons working. But then we can't run away from the fact that Singapore has grown so much since 1980. Tampines in 1980, I don't even know whether it was an established estate with housing.
I don't think so. Yeah.
But today, it has multiple MRT stations, interchanges, there are like sports halls there. I think one of the main selling points back when I was Googling properties when I was buying it was one of the only estates back then, I don't know whether it still is now, to have 3 malls in their MRT station, near the vicinity of the MRT station.
Right.
That was one of the main selling points. Yeah. Prices should reflect that, right?
Right.
Even regardless of household income, let's say household income was normalized, a better location would generally attract a higher price.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about we're paying more because of inflation, but we are also paying more. Prices are higher also because estates in Singapore are just much more developed today compared to the past where amenities were lacking.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I want to talk about is that flat prices is really not the only factor we should also look at when we think about affordability. I think one thing I found out is the interest rate has also changed significantly. Do you know that in the 70s and 80s, HDB mortgage interest rates were 6.25%?
Obviously, I didn't know that, but just thinking back, I think interest rates were higher back then as well. Even CPF interest rates are higher back then.
Right.
And so naturally, the mortgage rate will be higher than that, right? So when I learned it, it was not a big surprise. But obviously, it wasn't something at the back of my mind.
Yeah, but that also plays a huge part, right? Because it also means that the monthly installment, the home mortgage that your parents took when they bought their flat will be higher than what it is today. Because today, obviously, we look at 2.6% as the default HDB rate. Has been there for many, many years already, a few decades. But 6.25% is a game changer in terms of how much more you have to pay for mortgage in terms of your installment
each
month.
About 2 to 3 times more, about 2.5 times more.
Right? Yeah. So I think that's also another factor. I think the other factor that we shouldn't ignore is really government grants as well. So I think today we have a lot more government grants. I guess it helps with the down payment.
I'm also not sure about like in the 80s whether there was some form of subsidies that made the housing price a bit more affordable. So I'm not 100% sure what happened.
I suspect it's just what they call the government subsidies, which is your BTO flats are just priced lower.
Yeah, so
they don't even call it BTO, by the way, last time.
Yeah. So today, that's what I was going to say, right? It's already having that subsidy. Is a costed at a lower price to surrounding HDB flats. So that's the government subsidy on the BTO flats itself.
Today, right?
Yeah. So today that's still in existence.
Yeah.
And then the government grants, like you say, it helps you, even if you think you can't afford it, I think it helps you buy the house.
In terms of the down payment,
yeah, because you get the down payment in that subsidy, right? And then you just have to afford, you just buy sensibly a house that you can afford with your monthly income.
Yep.
And then service that mortgage after that.
Yep.
So it's not about whether you can buy a home, it's about whether you can buy the home that you want, right?
I still remember like the first couple of flats, at least this is what my dad told me, right? Like they just don't have money to renovate the home. I don't know if you guys watching this, whether...
I think if my dad watches this, he will wish I don't know whether he wish I say this or not, but he tells me this maybe every 1 or 2 months I hear this.
All right.
So when they first bought their place, they first bought their place in Serangoon Central. Now it's beside Next Mall, so it's a crazy good location. But back then, it was not a good location, right? So that flat, he said when he first moved in, he didn't have money to renovate, so he got one of his friends to help him do some tiling work.
Sounds like the same problem every older person has.
So one of his friends, he couldn't afford to pay like a commercial firm. One of his friends helped him with some tiling work, or to some extent, that kind of work. And then when he moved in, he didn't have any money for furniture, so he used bed sheets as curtains.
Yep.
He sat on the floor eating his dinner for a month because he didn't have money to buy a table, chairs.
Yep.
And my mum washed clothes with her hands for 1 or 2 months, and then my dad used his first or second paycheck or whatever savings out of it to buy a washing machine.
Sounds like a great investment, man.
That was the first appliance he bought.
As much as we say that HDB flats today are more expensive, it just feels like people can afford to renovate the home to become a dream home. Whereas in the past, as much as we say that HDB flats were cheaper back then, we have to recognize that earnings were much lower. There's no government grant. And you have, incidents like this, which I think is super common. Just ask your parents, like when they move into the HDB flat, they don't have money to renovate it, like how you see some of the home tours today. So, sometimes it just makes me wonder if, aspirations have changed significantly. Because I think when my parents bought their first place, it is not just their first home. It is actually, correct me if I'm wrong, if my uncle or auntie watch this, but it's actually the first home that they live in that is actually owned by them.
Yeah.
Because before that, it was just rental units. So the entire family, so not just my parents, my grandparents, as well as my uncles and aunties, they all moved in to that first 4-room HDB flat and live for a few years with him before they all had their own flats later on when there's more HDB flats. So the aspirations have changed significantly from just being a home so that, we have shelter. And I think today most of us grow up, with a home, right? And the aspirations have changed in the sense that we want our own place. And we don't only want our own place, we want it to be kind of like a dream home, right? Because you wouldn't want to move out of your parents' place and then under-renovate the new place and maybe your old room is better.
I think hearing you say that, I got two main thoughts, right? So one is just like a very abstract thought on like, maybe back then in the 70s, 60s, I don't know how far back we want to go, housing maybe was cheaper because there was a national interest in that home ownership scheme.
Yes, of course.
Right? So it was in the government's interest to house everyone as well. So it makes sense on some level that they need to subsidize people to adopt that behavior. So today, Singapore 90% home ownership rate, I think is very stark contrast to global statistics. But I think it's a very high amount compared to global, right? So in the initial days to adopt this habit that we all take for natural today, I think there would have been some incentive for the government to like, hey, we give you this flat. We want you, your family to move in as fast as possible as well. The other thing that also like came into my mind when you mentioned that your dad's scenario in the earlier years when he bought his first place was, what about household income sizes, right? Like I'm assuming it was larger.
I mean, like
much larger.
I can share with you exactly.
Back then.
Let me count. He had 8 siblings. Himself, my mom, 10. My brother was born 11, and his parents, my grandparents. So I think 13
there's no
people.
statutes of limitations. We were done with
13 people.
But, so that's the other thing, right? Household sizes, maybe even if you take average, I believe 13 sounds like above average. But even if you take average, I think there were more people in each house back then compared to today. And so it feels like if you want to buy a home, it's much more aspirational. If you want to buy a home today, it's also aspirational in the sense that you can afford a home, but you just want to buy the dream home, right? Then it becomes much harder to afford. When you do buy it, you should buy it with some financial responsibility, right? Don't overbuy a home that you can't pay in the end, right? But once you have that starter home, then aspire, man. I wish like all of them can move into their dream homes.
Do you think anybody watching this episode buys into what we just say, which is that flats today are just as affordable as it used to be in our parents' time? My parents, I still remember when they bought their first flat, they were earning like, I think about $300 a month. And then the first flat was like $24,500. I think it was in like in Ang Mo Kio or something. Income level as well as flat prices rose quickly over the first 2 to 3 decades because Singapore was just growing so quickly, right? But I just can't help but feel like we're kind of like doing a disservice to some of the older people in terms of when we say that their flats are very affordable compared to today, because we don't appreciate or understand just how little they were earning back then, relative to what your parents, my parents were earning. That isn't cheap for them. And
I can share with you another thing that my dad always tells me, so I hear this story quite regularly as well. So I don't think he had enough money in his CPF and my mom's CPF to pay for the first home that they bought.
Yeah, probably
so
because
he had to scrimp like every last dollar. I think he had to maybe ask for salary earlier here and there just to afford the down payment. We are in a fortunate situation today where I think we just explained like the down payment is almost covered for us today if we want to buy a home.
I mean, some people will disagree, but yeah, for sure there's additional housing grant. If you buy a resale flat, there's the HDB grant of 40 to 50,000 and proximity housing grant. So this can add up to 100,000 or more sometimes.
Yeah. But did they want a better home? I'm assuming everyone wants a better home, right? But they bought what they could afford back then.
Just talking to some young people, they also hope for, like, location is important.
Yeah.
Right. And I get it, right? Because you don't want to be like staying at where we are in the East. Whereas back then, it's like, just give me a home. Anywhere will do.
Yeah.
Right. I still remember when we moved to Pasir Ris, there was no MRT. We stopped at Tampines and then my mom and I have to take a bus from Tampines to Pasir Ris. But my point is that a lot of these towns that we live in, they were very underdeveloped back then. Those are some of the things that previous generation also had to deal with.
Yeah. I feel like we are really in a good situation today where the roof over our head is more or less guaranteed if you do work, whether it's the subsidies offered by the government or the grants offered.
Okay. And I just want to ask you one last question, which is ultimately, right, what do you think when I say affordable housing in Singapore? What does it really mean? Because I'm sure we can all agree it doesn't mean having HDB prices back in the 80s or 90s again.
I think there's some easy rules of thumbs that we can go back to see what's affordable, right? Don't pay more than 5 times your annual income. to buy the place, right? This is based on your personal affordability.
Okay.
Right. But I think on an overarching sense, like we shouldn't worry about home prices as long as incomes go up. I think why it's so stuck is because maybe it's one generation. Our parents paid this amount and then we are paying that 10 times. Whereas in most other places in the world, and now I'm just thinking or conjecturing, it's not a one generation thing. It's like a few generations where the prices go up that much.
Over a longer period of time, right?
And then just to extend it, I'm not sure whether our kids' generation will then experience that same burst in income and asset price growth, right? It's hard to imagine.
I just doubt so. Yeah. So yeah, because we are already a super developed city. So to expect, I mean, we went from third world to first world in like one generation. To expect that level of growth again in the next 50, 60 years doesn't make sense in my opinion.
So I think we just grow so fast that the numbers seem out of whack. But actually, if you dive down into it, maybe some form, it does make sense on some forms. And then the second point is that you should have your own rules of thumbs, right? Don't overextend yourself. I think the government is doing its part as far as it can. And then we should do our part as well.
Yeah. Maybe one thing just to add before we end is that I do feel on the other hand that private sector condos and such has become definitely much more expensive compared to what it used to be. So maybe that's also another thought that, some of you may think as well, whether that 5C, the condo dream is still realistic for the middle income Singaporeans today.
I guess before we end off, maybe the one thought I always had on that conversation is that 80% of people live in, or almost 80% people live in HDB, right? So if you think you're the median income, you should be living in HDB.
Fair enough.
Right? Only the top 20% gets to live in private. Unfortunately, land scarce Singapore, we have to go by that statistics as well.
And yes, I think we're done for today's discussion. Thanks so much for your thoughts, Dinesh.
Great. I think I enjoy these kind of conversations. Hopefully, we don't get too much flack online.
Yeah, we will. I mean, we'd be happy to see the comments. I'm sure some of you agree and many will also disagree, right? So HDB flat today may look a lot more expensive than they did in our parents' generation, but affordability isn't just about sticker price. When we consider rising income, accessible financing, and the support of housing grants, the picture becomes a lot clearer. The goal of public housing is always to provide Singaporeans with a stable and sustainable home that they can afford. And thank you for listening to us on the DollarsAndSense Podcast. If you found today's episode helpful, don't forget to follow us on YouTube or Spotify wherever you're watching or listening to this. We will see you again.